The snow didn't fall that morning. It swallowed. The sky wasn't just gray, it was gone. A thick white blanket smothered the world, erasing the horizon, the trees, the very sound of the wind itself. All that remained was the crunch, a slow, agonizing crunch of thin boots breaking through the crust of a frozen world. With every step, a cloud of steam puffed from blue lips. With every breath, a fire burned in lungs that were long past cold. Her name was Talqua Monroe. She was 24 years old and she was carrying a ghost. She didn't have a proper coat, just a thin wool wrap, its edges frayed and stiff with ice. She clutched a bundle to her chest, a small, tight package wrapped in linen. She held it like it was still breathing because her arms had forgotten how to let go. Behind her, a faint trail of footprints marked her desperate path across the prairie. But the wind was a cruel housekeeper, sweeping them away like crumbs from a table. In minutes, there was no trace, no mercy. It was as if she had never been there at all. She hadn't planned on walking this far, but then she hadn't planned on surviving the night either. There was no road out here, just endless, rolling white and the occasional fence post, leaning like a tired old man against the storm. She didn't know when she'd crossed from familiar land into the unknown. Maybe she didn't care. There was nothing left for her back there. Nothing but a shallow grave, too shallow to keep the wolves out. Nothing but in-laws whose whispers cut deeper than any winter wind. They called her barren, a failure. They said it after she birthed a son too small, too early, and buried him herself before the first snows came. Her knees didn't buckle with drama. There was no cry, no final plea to the blank white sky. The world simply tilted on its axis, and she sank with it. Her body curled into a small ball against the splintered wood of a fence post, finding a sliver of shelter in its long, thin shadow. She didn't close her eyes. She just stared out at the whiteness, no longer sure if she was looking at the sky or if her own life was fogging over at the edges. This was it, the end of the trail, the final fade to white. And it would have been if he hadn't been walking that same godforsaken stretch of fence line. His name was Cale Ten Crow. He was 31, and he wasn't looking for a person. He was looking for firewood. The deep snow had erased the elk trails, and his horse, stubborn and wise, had refused to go another step. So he walked. He wore no shirt, just a thick buffalo hide slung over his shoulders. His skin was copper, weathered by 1,000 suns and 100 winters. A long black braid hung down his back, tied with a leather cord. His boots were crusted in frost, and a heavy axe was slung low across his back. He moved through the storm, not like a man fighting it, but like a man who was part of it. He didn't expect to find a woman kneeling in the snow. At first, he thought she was a ghost, a trick of the wind and the falling flakes. She was so still, her dark hair tangled with ice, her face as pale as the drifts around her. He thought she was dead. But then he saw it. A single faint puff of breath, a cloud of life in a world of white death. He didn't call out, he didn't make a sound. He just moved toward her, his steps silent in the deep powder. He knelt beside her, his presence a dark, solid shape against the blinding snow. With fingers too callous to tremble, he reached out and gently brushed the ice-matted hair from her face. She flinched. A tiny, bird-like movement. But she was too weak to pull away. Her lips were cracked and blue. She tried to speak, her voice a dry rasp, barely a whisper. I didn't mean to trespass. He didn't answer. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from, or why her cheek bore the faint, ugly mark of a slap. He didn't ask about the bundle she clutched to her chest as if it held the last fire in the world. He just looked at her, and in his dark, unreadable eyes, she saw not pity, but recognition, the quiet understanding of a fellow survivor. Without a word, he scooped her up. She was impossibly light. He cradled her and her precious bundle together, as if they were twin broken things that belonged to each other. Snow peeled off her thin dress in sheets as he lifted her. She smelled of winter and grief, a scent both bitter and sweet. He turned and began the long walk back to his cabin, leaving only one set of footprints in the snow. It was almost as if he had been expecting her. The cabin was a mile east, tucked so deep in a stand of pines you'd never find it unless you already knew it was there. It was small, sturdy, built of dark logs chinked with mud and moss. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the white sky. Inside, the hearth was still glowing with embers. Cale didn't put her down. He stoked the fire with one hand, his other arm holding her securely against his chest. The flames leaped up, hungry for the fresh wood, and began to throw warmth back into the small room. Only then did he lay her down on a thick pallet of furs near the fire. He was careful, his movements slow and deliberate. He never tried to take the bundle from her arms. He'd seen death before. He knew that sometimes holding on is the only thing that keeps a person from shattering completely. The snow hissed against the single window pane. The fire crackled and snapped. For a long time, those were the only sounds. She woke up slowly. Her breath hitched, the sound an animal makes when it sniffs danger in the air. Her eyelashes, tipped with melted frost, fluttered against her cheeks. Her first words weren't thanks. They weren't a question about where she was. Her first words were a demand. Is it morning? Cale was sitting on a low stool across the room, sharpening a knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone stopped. Near enough, he said. His voice was deep but quiet, like the sound of a creek running low in a drought. You're safe. She stared at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling. I don't remember walking here. You didn't. He didn't offer his name. She didn't offer hers. Names were for people who expected to live long enough to use them again. The firelight painted her face in soft, flickering gold, but it couldn't hide everything. Cale saw the raw tension in her fingers, the way they gripped the cloth of her bundle. It was a death grip, as if letting go meant something worse than just being empty-handed. He didn't ask. He never asked. Instead, he poured steaming water from a kettle into a tin cup, dropped in a few pine needles, and set it on the floor near her trembling hands. The sharp, clean scent of pine filled the air. She didn't touch it. You should eat, he said, his voice still low. I don't want anything. She turned her head away, facing the wall of stacked logs. Even wolves eat when they're hurt. Something in her twitched at that, a flicker of defiance in her exhausted eyes. You a preacher? No, he said, returning to his knife. Just someone who knows pain doesn't leave unless you let it sit near a fire for a while. She didn't speak again that day. He let the silence settle between them like a layer of dust, heavy and undisturbed. That night she didn't sleep. Not really. Cale sat with his back against the cabin door, his rifle across his knees. He listened to her breathing, thin, quick, and terrified. She was like a trapped bird, her heart beating too fast. Once, she cried out in her sleep. A choked, desperate gasp. Her hands tightened on the bundle, and she whispered a name, something too soft for him to make out. He didn't try to hear it. Some words aren't meant for other people's ears. He just rose silently, placed another log on the fire, and went back to his vigil. A guardian carved from shadow and stillness. The storm didn't stop the next day, or the day after that. It was a blizzard that buried the world, locking them inside the small cabin. Time seemed to slow down, measured only by the rising and falling of the fire. On the third morning, Tali finally stood up. She was weak, unsteady on her feet, but she made her way to the window. Her arms were still wrapped around the bundle. She stared out at the endless, churning white. She spoke without turning, her voice a whisper. I had a name once. Cale was mending a snowshoe, his fingers deft and sure. He didn't look up. You still do? I mean, before, she said. Before they said I wasn't a real wife. Before they told me I brought death with me. Before they left me to bury my son alone. He stopped his work. He was silent for a long moment. the only sound the howl of the wind outside. Then he said, "You walked through a blizzard carrying the memory of someone no one else would. That makes you more of a woman than most." She closed her eyes. The tears she expected didn't come. They were all used up, frozen somewhere deep inside her. She finally turned to face him. "Why didn't you ask me who I was? Why I was out there?" Cale stood and walked to the hearth, stirring the coals with a poker. The embers glowed a fierce, angry red. "Figured you'd tell me when you were ready," he said, his back to her. "Or not. A fire doesn't ask a cold man why he's freezing. It just burns." A long, shuddering breath escaped her. It was the sound of something inside her, something that had been clenched tight for months, finally starting to break. She looked down at the bundle in her arms, at the small, precious weight that was both everything and nothing. Slowly, with the reverence of a priestess at an altar, she walked to the fur pallet and laid the bundle down. She didn't unwrap it. She just placed it on a folded blanket. Her hands hovered over it for a moment, shaking, before she pulled them away. It was the first time she had let it go. Cale saw the movement from the corner of his eye. He didn't look at the bundle. He didn't say a word. He just picked up his axe, walked to the door, and stepped outside into the raging storm. He left the door ajar, just a crack. It wasn't an invitation to follow. It was a message. You are not a prisoner here. You are free to go. You are free to stay. The wind howled past the opening, a wild, mournful sound. Snowflakes swirled into the room, melting on the warm floorboards. Outside, Cale began to split wood, the rhythmic thump of the axe a steady heartbeat in the heart of the storm. He let the cold claw at his bare skin, but he didn't shiver. Inside, Tali watched him through the crack in the door. She saw the snow on his shoulders, the steam rising from his back. He was like a mountain, something that could withstand any storm. Her eyes drifted around the small cabin. It was a man's space, sparse and practical, but it was clean, orderly. There were shelves of dried herbs, tools hung in their proper places, a stack of books with worn leather spines, and in the corner, almost hidden in the shadows, she saw it. A cradle. It was empty, handmade from smooth, pale cedar wood. It was small, perfect, and polished by hands that knew loss. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at the cradle, then quickly looked away, a fresh wave of pain washing over her. But this time, the pain felt different. It wasn't just hers anymore. That night she ate. A small bowl of stew, thick with rabbit and wild roots. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if she were learning how to taste again. She even combed the tangles out of her hair with her fingers and braided it loosely down her back. When she finally looked him in the eye across the small, flickering fire, her voice was quiet but steady. "My name is Tahlequah," she said, "but folks call me Tali." Cale nodded once, his expression unreadable in the dancing firelight. "I'm Cale." They didn't say anything more, but in the space between their names, something shifted. A truce was declared, a silent acknowledgement between two wounded creatures who were too tired to fight anymore. Outside, the storm raged on, trying to tear the world apart. Inside, the fire burned bright, and two people sat in a shared silence that was stronger than any wall. They had both walked through their own personal blizzards, and for the first time in a long time, neither of them was walking alone. But the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was coming for them, because Tali hadn't just been running from grief. She was running from a secret that was buried deeper than any grave, a secret that people would kill to keep hidden. And it was a secret she had carried with her, wrapped in a linen bundle, all the way to Cale's door. For 3 days, the world remained buried in white. Time felt thick and slow, like honey dripping in winter. Inside the cabin, it was always dusk, the air filled with the scent of pine smoke and the low crackle of the fire. Tali moved like a ghost. She cleaned the edge of the iron stove, folded a spare blanket, her hands never making a sound. Her silence was a fortress. She was watching Cale, studying him. She saw the way he sharpened his axe before dawn, the way he hauled water, the way he never, ever looked directly at the bundle she'd placed on the furs. He was a man of ritual and quiet strength, but she saw something else in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, a flicker of a storm that matched her own. He continued to leave the door ajar every night, a constant, silent reminder of her freedom. She didn't leave, not because she trusted him, but because the world outside was a blank page of death, and this small, warm room felt like the only solid thing left. On the third night, the wind finally calmed. The world went still, and frost drew delicate, feathery patterns on the window pane. Cale came in, his arms loaded with firewood, and stopped dead in his tracks. Tali was standing by the window. Her back was to him. She was humming. A quiet, broken lullaby. A melody that stumbled and never found its end. Her shoulders were shaking, not from cold, but from a grief so deep it was a physical tremor. Cale set the wood down without a sound. "You all right?" he asked softly. She didn't turn. Her voice was thin, like a frayed thread. "I used to sing that. To him." The words caught in her throat. "I know that song," Cale said after a long pause. His voice was rough with an emotion he rarely showed. "My mother sang it. She said it kept the spirits of the wind gentle." Tali nodded once, her forehead pressed against the cold glass. "It didn't keep mine gentle." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Later, at the small table, she pushed her bowl of stew away, untouched. Cale sat across from her, mending a tear in a buckskin coat. His stitches were small and perfect, like everything he did. "I had a name," she whispered to the table, to the fire, to the ghosts in the room. Cale didn't look up from his sewing. "Still do." "No," she said, her voice cracking. "Not one I recognize. Back in town. They stopped using it. I was just her, or the one with the dead baby, or that poor thing. Sometimes I was nothing at all. I forgot what it sounded like when someone said it without pity." His needle stilled. He finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers across the flickering candlelight. "What name do you want to hear?" She couldn't answer. She just shook her head, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down her cold cheek. He didn't press her. He took her uneaten stew, set it by the fire to keep warm, and went back to his mending. But something had changed. A wall had been breached. The next morning, the sky was a blinding, brilliant blue. The world was dazzling, covered in a fresh, clean blanket of snow. For the first time, Tali stepped outside willingly. She stood barefoot on the porch, the biting cold of the wood a sharp, grounding pain. She tilted her head back, letting the pale winter sun touch her face. Cale saw her from the woodpile. He stopped his work, watching her. She wasn't testing the world anymore. She was claiming her small piece of it. When she came back inside, her cheeks flushed with color, she asked him, "You ever been called something you hated?" Cale blew on his hands to warm them. "I was born Cale 10 Crow, after my father, and the crow that cried on the night of my birth. But in town, the white men call me Red Dog, or Savage. They say I should walk behind them, not beside them." Her eyes held his. "Did it ever get easier?" "No," he said simply. "But I stopped answering to it." A fragile understanding passed between them, a recognition of shared wounds, of names that had been twisted into weapons. Later that week, their fragile peace was shattered. 2 riders appeared at the edge of the woods, a man with a narrow, cruel face and a woman whose eyes were as sharp and cold as chips of ice. Tali recognized them instantly. They were Cale's neighbors, the Gundersons, but they weren't here for a friendly visit. Cale met them outside, his stance relaxed but ready. Their voices carried on the still, cold air, sharp and ugly. "Heard you got company, 10 Crow," Gunderson said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice into the pure white snow. "Weather brought a traveler to my door," Cale replied, his voice even. "I didn't turn her out." The woman, Elspeth Gunderson, leaned forward in her saddle. "She a white woman?" Her voice was a venomous hiss. "The town is talking. They say you're keeping her, forcing her, that you're trying to plant your filthy seed where it don't belong." Cale's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "What I do in my own home is my business." "You gonna make an honest woman of her?" Gunderson sneered. "You even know what that means, boy?" "I didn't ask for gossip." Cale's voice dropped, becoming dangerously quiet. "I asked you to leave my land." Inside, Tali stood pressed against the log wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was what she had been running from. The whispers, the accusations, the poison that spread from tongue to tongue. When Cale stepped back inside, closing the door firmly behind him, she was waiting. "I heard them," she said, her voice shaking. He nodded once, his face a grim mask. "They're not wrong," she whispered. "I shouldn't be here. I bring trouble." "But you are here," he said, turning to face her. "You don't know what I've done," she choked out, the words tasting like ash. "You don't know why I was really out there. I know you nearly died in a blizzard holding on to a memory." "I failed," she cried, the word tearing out of her. "I failed him!" Cale stepped closer, his presence filling the small space. His voice was gentle, but firm as bedrock. "You carried the weight of a life that didn't get to be. You didn't fail. You hurt. There's a difference." She looked up at him, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "I can't even say his name. I can't say my own name without hearing them. Hearing their judgment." "Then don't say it," Cale said, his gaze intense. "Not yet. Wait until it sounds like your own again. Wait until it sounds like something holy." That night, he placed a small leather pouch on the table between them. It was filled with seeds: corn, squash, and beans, the three sisters. "You plant these in the spring," he said. "But first you have to believe the ground will accept them." Tali stared at the pouch, as if it contained precious jewels. "I haven't believed in anything for a very long time." "Then just believe in the fire for now," he said quietly. "It's enough." Later, long after Cale had fallen asleep in his chair, Tali knelt by the hearth. The cabin was silent except for the soft breathing of the man who had saved her and the whisper of the flames. She opened her hand, looking at the seeds. Then she looked at the fire, and she whispered a name into the flames, a name she hadn't dared to speak for months. "Samuel." It was the name of her son. The fire didn't flinch. It just seemed to burn a little brighter, a little warmer, as if it had been waiting to hear it all along. But Tali had another secret, a darker one. The bundle she had carried wasn't just filled with grief and memory. It held something tangible, something dangerous. It held proof that her son's death wasn't a tragedy. It was murder. And the people who did it were not going to let her live to tell the tale. They were hunting her, and they were getting closer. The days that followed found a new rhythm, a quiet, hesitant dance of healing. Tali woke each morning to the sound of Cale's axe splitting wood, a steady, life-affirming beat. He wasn't just chopping for survival anymore. He was shaping their world. One morning, he handed her a thick leather glove. "Ever mended a fence?" he asked. She shook her head. He didn't explain. He just handed her a spool of wire and started walking. They followed a winding trail through the silent, snow-covered aspens to a stretch of fence line that was broken and buried in drifts. "Wrap it low," he instructed, his voice a low rumble. "Not too tight, just enough to hold. You try to force the land, it pushes back." Her fingers were clumsy and cold, but she worked patiently, post by post. Her muscles ached with a clean, honest pain. It felt good. It felt like she was building something instead of just falling apart. They worked side by side for hours, wrapped in a comfortable silence. When her hands started to blister, he handed her a small tin of salve made from pine resin and tallow. He didn't offer to apply it for her. He let her tend to her own wounds. She was grateful for that. That night, as they sat by the fire, she finally asked him about the cradle. "You built it," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. He nodded, his eyes on the flames. "Why is it here?" she asked softly. Why didn't you get rid of it? Cale was silent for a long time. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. I came here after my wife died, he said, his voice thick. Her name was Lena, a white woman, stronger than any man I ever knew. She gave me a son. Tali's breath caught. He didn't live long enough to hear his own name, Cale continued, his voice hollow. The fever took them both in the same winter. I built that cradle for him. I buried them both on the hill behind this cabin. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words inadequate. I kept it, he said, finally looking at her. Because getting rid of it felt like saying he never existed. And he did. He was real. In that moment, their shared grief became a bridge between them. 2 empty cradles, 2 lost children, 2 shattered hearts, beating in the same quiet room. The next day she found a small fox cub, its leg caught in a cruel iron trap left by a poacher. It was whimpering, its fur matted with blood and snow. She didn't hesitate. She called for Cale, and together they carried the wounded creature inside. They cleaned the wound, splinted the tiny leg, and laid the cub on a blanket by the fire. Tali stayed with it all night, stroking its soft fur and humming her broken lullaby. For the first time, the song felt less like a lament and more like a prayer. As she cared for the fox, she began to care for herself. She started speaking more, her voice growing stronger each day. She told him about the beans she'd boiled, the tear she'd mended in his shirt. She named the fox Ash, because he rose from the cold. One morning, while splitting kindling, Cale's axe slipped. He gashed his palm open, a deep, clean cut that bled freely. Before he could react, Tali was there. She took his hand, her touch gentle but firm. Sit, she commanded. He obeyed without question. She cleaned the wound with whiskey and bound it tightly with a strip of clean linen. You don't have to carry this whole world alone, she whispered, her head bent over his hand. He didn't answer, but when he looked at her, his dark eyes were full of a raw, unguarded emotion that made her heart skip a beat. But their fragile peace was living on borrowed time. The whispers from the town were growing louder, carried on the wind like poison dust. And Tali's past was not as buried as she had hoped. One afternoon, a wagon appeared on the ridge, rolling slowly towards the cabin. It wasn't the Gundersons this time. It was the law, a portly, red-faced sheriff, and riding beside him, a man Tali knew all too well, Tobias Waywright, the brother of her late husband, a man with cold, dead eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. Cale stepped outside to meet them, his rifle held loosely in one hand. Tali stood in the doorway, her body rigid, her hand instinctively going to the small, empty bundle that still lay on the furs. We heard she was here, Ten Crow, the sheriff said, not bothering with pleasantries. She's under my protection, Cale replied, his voice flat and hard as stone. Tobias Waywright slid off his horse, his boots sinking into the mud and slush of the melting snow. He smirked, his gaze locking on Tali. Protection, is that what you call it? She ran away, from her family, from her duties. I have no family left, Tali's voice rang out sharp and clear. You made sure of that. You are a Waywright, Tobias spat. Your grief doesn't change that. You belong with us. The town agrees. It ain't right, a woman like you living out here with him. This woman makes her own choices, Cale said, taking a half-step forward, placing himself between Tali and the other men. This woman, Tobias sneered, is unstable. She's lost her mind, wandering the wilderness with a bundle of rags, pretending it's a child. She needs to be brought back, for her own good. Tali's blood ran cold. He knew. He was twisting the truth, painting her as a madwoman. The bundle is none of your concern, she said, her voice trembling but defiant. Oh, but it is, Tobias said, his eyes glittering with malice. Because my brother, your sainted husband, left certain properties. And since you failed to provide a living heir, those properties revert to me. But there are papers, legal documents, and I have reason to believe you took them when you fled. It was a lie, a brilliant, vicious lie. There were no papers about property, but there was something else, something far more valuable. "I have nothing that belongs to you," Tali said. "Then you won't mind if we search the cabin," the sheriff said, his hand moving towards the pistol on his hip. "Just to be sure." "You are not setting foot in my home," Cale said, his voice dropping to a low growl. He raised the rifle, the movement fluid and deadly. The sheriff's eyes widened. "Now hold on, Ten Crow. Don't be foolish." "It's not foolish to protect what's mine," Cale said. Tobias laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "What's yours? You think she's yours? A broken, barren woman who couldn't even keep her own child alive?" The words hit Tali like a physical blow. She staggered back, the breath knocked from her lungs. In that moment of distraction, Tobias moved. He wasn't going for a gun. He lunged for the cabin door, pushing past Cale, his eyes fixed on one thing: the bundle. He dove for it, his hands snatching at the linen wrapping. "No!" Tali screamed. Cale spun around, bringing the butt of his rifle up in a powerful arc. It connected with the side of Tobias's head with a sickening crack. Tobias crumpled to the floor, groaning. The sheriff drew his pistol. "Drop it, Ten Crow! Drop it now!" Cale stood his ground, the rifle still leveled, his body shielding Tali and the bundle. "Get off my land," he ordered, his voice echoing with cold fury. The sheriff hesitated, his gaze flicking from Cale's determined face to the unconscious man on the floor. He was a town lawman, not a hero. He wasn't willing to die for Tobias Wayright's greed. He slowly holstered his pistol. "This ain't over," he snarled. "The Wayrights are powerful people. They won't forget this." He dragged Tobias's limp body out of the cabin, slung him over his horse like a sack of grain, and rode away, leaving a trail of threats hanging in the cold air. The silence that descended on the cabin was deafening. Tali was shaking violently, her arms wrapped around herself. Cale finally lowered the rifle, his knuckles white. He turned to her, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. "Tali, what was he talking about? What's in that bundle that he wants so badly?" Tali looked at him, her eyes wide with terror and a terrible dawning certainty. They knew, they suspected, and now they would stop at nothing to get it back. She sank to her knees, her hands trembling as she reached for the bundle. It was time for the truth, all of it. "He lied," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's not about property." With shaking fingers, she began to unwrap the linen cloth. Fold after fold, it wasn't empty. There was something inside, something small, hard, and cold. She pulled it out and held it up in the flickering firelight. It wasn't a document. It wasn't money. It was a tiny, intricately carved wooden bird, a swallow. Its wings were spread as if in mid-flight. Cale stared at it, confused. "What is it?" "It was Samuel's," she whispered. "My husband, he carved it for him. It was the only thing of his father's he ever got to hold." "I don't understand," Cale said. "Why would Tobias risk his life for a child's toy?" Tali took a deep, shuddering breath, the truth finally spilling out of her like a torrent. "Because it's not just a toy. My husband, he was a good man, but he was weak. His family, the Wayrights, they own the town. The bank, the mill, the sheriff, all of it. They're corrupt. They've been cheating people out of their land for years. My husband knew. He was ashamed, but he was too afraid to speak out." She turned the small bird over in her palm. "Before Samuel was born, my husband started getting brave. He started making notes, keeping a secret ledger. He documented everything. The names, the dates, the stolen properties. He hid it all." Her eyes met Cale's, and in them he saw the terrifying truth. "He hid it inside this bird," she whispered. "It's hollow. The ledger, written on thin, rolled-up pieces of paper, is tucked inside." Cale's blood ran cold. It all clicked into place. The desperation, the violence, Tobias's lies. "Samuel, my baby." Tali's voice broke, the words choked with a grief so profound it was almost unbearable. "His death wasn't a fever. The doctor, he works for the Wayrights. He gave him something to make him sleep. A sleep he never woke up from. They murdered my son. They murdered him to silence my husband and to get this. She held up the bird, the proof of their crimes, the reason for her son's death. I knew they would come for me next, she said, tears streaming down her face. I grabbed the bird and I ran. I wasn't running from grief, Cale. I was running for my life. The quiet cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was the center of a storm. Cale looked from the tiny wooden bird to the woman kneeling on his floor, and he understood. He hadn't just saved a woman from a blizzard. He had brought a war to his doorstep. The Waywrights wouldn't send the sheriff next time. They would send killers. And they wouldn't stop until they had the bird, and silenced the only person left who knew their secret. Cale looked at the handmade cradle in the corner of the room, the cradle he had built for his own lost son. A cold, hard rage began to smolder in his chest, a rage he hadn't felt since the day he buried his wife and child. They had taken her son, just like the fever had taken his. He walked to the door and bolted it shut. The sound of the heavy iron bolt sliding into place echoed in the silent room. It was no longer a symbol of her freedom to leave. It was a declaration. He picked up his rifle, his movements calm and purposeful. He checked the load, his hands steady. They want a war, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Then we'll give them one. The silence in the cabin was now thick with a new kind of tension, not fear, but resolve. Tali had finally shared her burden, and in doing so, she had passed a torch to Cale. A torch of vengeance. He looked at her, his eyes dark and intense. Did he ever mention a woman named Lena? Tali frowned, searching her memory. Lena, I don't think so. Why? She was my wife, Cale said, his voice flat. She was a healer. She helped a lot of people in town. She started asking questions about why so many small farmers were losing their land to the Waywrights, about why so many accidents were happening at the mill. A dawning horror crept into Tali's eyes. The fever that took her and my son, Cale said, his voice barely a whisper. It came on fast, too fast. The town doctor, the same one who saw your Samuel, he said there was nothing he could do. The unspoken truth hung between them, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just Samuel. They were connected by a web of death, spun by the same spider. They didn't just take your family, Tali whispered. They took yours, too. Cale didn't need to answer. The grim set of his jaw said it all. This was no longer just her fight. It was his. It was theirs. He began to prepare. He barred the single window with a heavy plank of wood. He laid out his ammunition on the table. A small but deadly supply of cartridges for the rifle and a box of shells for a shotgun he pulled from beneath his bed. He sharpened his axe until the edge gleamed in the firelight. Tali watched him, her fear slowly being replaced by a cold, hard anger. She had been a victim for too long. Now she was a survivor. She took the wooden bird and with trembling hands pried open a tiny, almost invisible seam along its back. Inside, nestled in a bed of raw cotton, were several tightly rolled scrolls of paper. The Waywright ledger. The proof. She carefully tucked the scrolls into a leather pouch and tied it around her neck, hiding it beneath her dress. The bird, now empty, she placed back in its linen wrapping. It would be their decoy. They worked through the night, a silent, determined team. They didn't talk about what was coming. They didn't have to. They could feel it in the air. The world outside had gone quiet, a predator holding its breath before the final strike. As dawn approached, painting the edges of the barred window with pale gray light, Ash, the fox cub, began to grow restless. He limped to the door, whining softly, his ears twitching. He hears something, Cale said, grabbing his rifle. They waited. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Then they heard it. The soft crunch of many feet in the snow. Not 2 riders this time. A dozen, maybe more. They were surrounding the cabin, moving with the quiet efficiency of wolves. A voice called out, smooth and cultured, but laced with menace. It was Tobias Waywright. Tahlequah, we know you're in there, and we know you have it. Be a sensible girl. Throw the bird out the window and we'll let your savage friend live. Tally's heart pounded. Cale put a calming hand on her shoulder. Don't listen to him, he whispered. He's a snake. You have 1 minute, Tobias shouted. Cale moved to a small chink in the log wall, peering out into the pre-dawn gloom. He could see their shapes, dark figures fanned out among the pines, rifles glinting. They were hopelessly outnumbered. Tally, he said, his voice urgent. There's a loose stone in the back of the hearth. Behind it is a tunnel. My father dug it. It comes out in the creek bed, 100 yards from here. When I give the signal, you take Ash and you run. Don't look back. Take the ledger to Judge Miller in the next county. He's an honest man. He was a friend of my father's. Tally stared at him, her eyes wide. I'm not leaving you. You have to, he said, his gaze locking with hers. This isn't about surviving anymore. It's about justice. For Samuel, for Lena, for my son. The ledger is the only thing that matters. You have to get it out. Time's up. Tobias's voice boomed, followed by the shattering of the cabin's only window. A flaming torch was thrown inside, landing on the dry furs of the pallet. The room erupted in smoke and flames. Now, Tally, go! Cale roared. He shoved the decoy bundle, the empty wooden bird wrapped in linen, into her hands. Throw this out the front. It'll buy you time. As Tally scrambled towards the hearth, Cale kicked the cabin door open and fired his rifle into the darkness. A man screamed and fell. The siege had begun. Tally pulled at the heavy stone in the hearth. It gave way, revealing a dark, narrow opening. She grabbed the whimpering fox cub, stuffing him gently inside her coat. With one last look at Cale, a dark silhouette fighting against a backdrop of fire and smoke, she threw the decoy bundle out the open door. The bird! Someone shouted from outside. It was the distraction they needed. Tally squeezed into the tunnel, the cold, damp earth pressing in on her from all sides. She began to crawl, pulling herself forward through the suffocating darkness, the sound of gunshots and shouting fading behind her. Cale fought like a cornered lion. He used the smoke and fire as cover, moving through the small cabin, firing his rifle and shotgun with deadly accuracy. He took down 2 more of Wayright's men before a bullet grazed his side, sending a searing pain through his body. He stumbled back, his vision blurring. Through the smoke, he saw Tobias Wayright step into the doorway, a pistol in his hand, a triumphant sneer on his face. He was holding the decoy bird. Looking for this? Tobias mocked, crushing the bird in his fist. It splintered into pieces. His eyes widened in fury as he saw it was empty. Where is it? Where's the ledger? Cale just smiled, a bloody, defiant grin. She's gone, he coughed, sinking to his knees. You've lost. Then you'll die for nothing, Tobias snarled, raising his pistol. Suddenly, a high-pitched snarl ripped through the air. Ash, the fox cub, had somehow wriggled free from the tunnel's entrance. He launched himself at Tobias, a tiny, furious ball of fur and teeth, sinking his sharp fangs into the man's gun hand. Tobias screamed in pain and surprise, dropping the pistol. It was the opening Cale needed. With his last ounce of strength, he lunged forward, not with his gun, but with the axe he had snatched from the wall. He brought it down not on the man, but on the main support beam of the cabin's porch roof, which was already groaning under the weight of the heavy snow. The axe bit deep into the wood. With a splintering crack, the beam gave way. The entire roof, laden with a winter's worth of snow and ice, collapsed with a deafening roar, burying Tobias Wayright and his remaining men in an avalanche of timber and frozen earth. Cale was thrown clear by the blast of the collapse, landing hard in the snow outside. He lay there, bleeding and broken, as the flames from his burning cabin lit up the morning sky. He had done it. He had bought her time. He closed his eyes, a single thought drifting through his mind. Run, Tally, run. The tunnel was a cold, dark womb. Tally crawled on her hands and knees, the damp earth staining her dress, the pouch with the ledger bouncing against her chest. Every scrape and rustle behind her sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind through the narrow passage sounded like Tobias Wayright's voice. She finally saw it, a faint circle of gray light ahead. The exit. She scrambled out into the biting morning air, emerging from behind a curtain of frozen cattails in the creek bed. She was covered in mud and soot, her lungs burning, but she was alive. And she had the ledger. She didn't look back at the pillar of black smoke rising from where the cabin had been. She couldn't. If she looked back, her courage would fail her. She just ran. She ran through the snow-choked woods, her only guide the position of the rising sun. She ran until her legs were numb, and her breath came in ragged, tearing gasps. She fell, picked herself up, and ran again. She was no longer Tahlequah Monroe, the grieving widow. She was a messenger, an avenger. It took her 2 days to reach the next county. She survived on stolen frozen apples from a deserted orchard and melted snow. She looked like a wild thing, her hair matted, her face gaunt, her eyes burning with a feverish intensity. She found Judge Miller's house on the outskirts of the town. It was a large, imposing brick building with white columns. She hesitated on the porch, suddenly terrified. What if Cale was wrong? What if the Wayright's corruption had spread this far? She took a deep breath, her hand clutching the leather pouch. For Samuel. For Lena. For Cale. She knocked on the heavy oak door. It was opened by the judge himself, a tall, stern-looking man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He looked down at the disheveled woman on his doorstep, his expression a mixture of surprise and disapproval. "What is it?" he asked, his voice stern. "My name is Tahlequah Monroe," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Cale 10 Crow sent me." At the mention of Cale's name, the judge's expression softened slightly. "Cale? Is he all right?" "I don't know," Tally whispered, the tears she had held back for so long finally welling in her eyes. "There was a fire, a fight." The judge ushered her inside, into a warm study lined with books. He sat her down in a leather chair by the fire and handed her a glass of brandy. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice kind. And she did. The story poured out of her. The death of her son, the stolen ledger, the flight through the snow, the siege at the cabin. When she was finished, she pulled the leather pouch from around her neck and handed the crumpled scrolls of paper to the judge. He unrolled them carefully, his eyes scanning the neat columns of names and figures. As he read, his face grew darker and darker. He let out a low whistle. "My God," he whispered. "The rumors were true. They've been bleeding that county dry for a decade." He looked at Tally, his eyes filled with a new respect. "You are a very brave woman, Mrs. Monroe." "Is it enough?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Is it enough to stop them?" "Oh, it's more than enough," the judge said, a grim smile touching his lips. "It's enough to hang them." The next morning, Judge Miller, accompanied by a dozen federal marshals, rode back towards the ashes of Cale's land. Tally went with them. She had to know. When they arrived, the scene was one of utter devastation. The cabin was gone, reduced to a smoking, blackened ruin. And in the snow, scattered around the collapsed porch, were the frozen bodies of Tobias Wayright and his men. But there was no sign of Cale. Tally's heart sank. She searched the ruins, calling his name, her voice raw with desperation. The marshals found his rifle, its stock shattered, and his axe, its handle burnt. But he was gone. They found tracks, a single set of footprints, accompanied by a drag trail, leading away from the cabin and into the deep woods. He had been wounded, but he had survived. He had gotten away. Tally stayed at Judge Miller's home while the law did its work. The ledger was undeniable proof. The entire Wayright empire came crashing down. The corrupt sheriff, the doctor, the bankers, they were all arrested. The town was thrown into chaos, but for the first time in years, the ordinary people had hope. The lands that had been stolen were returned to their rightful owners. Tally was a hero, but she felt empty. Every day she would walk to the edge of the woods and stare into the trees, hoping to see a familiar figure emerge from the shadows. But the woods remained silent. Weeks turned into months. The snow melted, and the first green shoots of spring began to push their way through the damp earth. Tali had found justice, but she hadn't found peace. The empty cradle in her heart ached for the man who had helped her find her strength. One evening, as she was sitting on the judge's porch, watching the sun set, she saw a small movement at the edge of the trees. Her heart stopped. It was a fox, a young cub with a slight limp. It stopped, looked directly at her, and then turned and disappeared back into the woods. It was Ash. Tali didn't hesitate. She ran from the porch, across the lawn, and into the forest, following the path the fox had taken. She ran, heedless of the branches that snagged her dress, her heart pounding with a wild, desperate hope. She found him by the creek, a mile into the woods. He had built a small, rough lean-to against a rock face. He was thin, gaunt, his side heavily bandaged, but he was alive. He was sitting by a small fire, carving a piece of wood with his knife. He looked up as she approached, his face breaking into a slow, tired smile. "I knew you'd come," Cale said, his voice rough. She couldn't speak. She just ran the last few feet and fell to her knees beside him, her hands touching his face, his hair, his shoulders, as if to reassure herself that he was real. He dropped the knife and the piece of wood and pulled her into his arms. They held each other for a long time, the silence filled with all the words they didn't need to say. Finally, he pulled back and pressed the piece of wood he had been carving into her hand. It was a bird, a swallow, its wings spread as if in mid-flight. It was almost identical to the one her husband had made. "A home isn't a structure," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers. "It's a choice. And you, Tahlequah Monroe, are my home." Tears streamed down her face, but this time they were tears of joy. She looked from the bird in her hand to the man who had seen the fire in her soul, and she knew she had finally found her place. They had both lost everything. They had walked through the fire and faced down death, but in the ashes of their old lives they had found something new, something stronger, something real. Together, they walked out of the woods, leaving the ghosts and the grief behind them, and stepped into the sunlight of a new day. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew they would face it together. Their story wasn't just about survival. It was about redemption, and it was a story that was far from over. If you enjoyed this story of survival, justice, and the resilience of the human heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You never know what secrets are buried just beneath the snow, waiting to be uncovered.